Decision Services Updates. Since the original training course was recorded, of course, the product has evolved. In this module, we'll look at 4 key areas that represent evolution between the original recording and today, which is the release of 22C. The 4 areas we're going to look at are data types, new and renamed functions, new mapping possibilities, and new warning messages. This presentation will be followed by a short demonstration of the majority of these features. So our first area for discussion is data types. Already in previous versions, we were familiar with the concept of an object list, which we sometimes refer to as a similar thing to an entity with some instances in it. Previously, those object lists meant that the author of a decision service could either map it in from an entity in Oracle Policy Modeling, or map it out to create an inferred entity coming out of the data service. Now the concept of an object list can go further. An object list can, as before, be inferred from an object list block. But in addition, we now have a function, or I should say functions, allowing the designer to create a subset of an existing object list and then to perform interesting tasks on an object list. An example of these 3 functions is provided later in this presentation. The second area of change is also on the subject of object lists. There is now an internal data type to represent a single instance of an object. For example, if you have an object list containing 3 rows, each of those rows represents an object, or rather, an object represents each of those rows. Unlike what we just discussed in the previous slide, this data type is purely internal, meaning it cannot be mapped in or out. It can, however, facilitate your rule design by enabling you to identify a row and then perform logic on it, such as making calculations or implementing some kind of rule. But, I repeat, the object cannot be directly passed as an output, so it remains that only object lists can be output. Once again, an example is provided later in this presentation. New and renamed functions. Well, unsurprisingly, to support the ideas that I've just been discussing, there are a couple of new functions. Specifically, the first one in respect of taking an object list and filtering it. So if you had an object list with 5 records in it, but you filtered it with a condition to produce a subset, this is the filter function. The filter function, like most of the entity functions of today, requires a condition. And that condition must either be a Boolean or a simple expression that can easily be resolved to a Boolean. So, for example, filter my object list, comma, and of course the comma will depend on your region, the customer type equals gold. That will work because it's a simple expression that can easily resolve to yes or no. Or you could use the more traditional and slightly more flexible version, which is to put the Boolean directly in the function. So the customer is gold, and then in another rule block, say that the customer is gold if the customer type equals gold. Both of those are perfectly acceptable. Still on the subject of object lists, and now focusing on this concept of an individual row in an object list being called an object, there are some new functions. The 2 most obvious are first and last. Each of them require as input a object list, and they will return a reference to 1 row, 1 instance maximum. Of course, if there are no rows in the object list, then they will return null. There are also more sophisticated versions where you can condition the output, but that shouldn't come as any surprise. What will strike you as odd is that the concept of being able to identify the first or the last row is something very different to what we're used to in Oracle Policy Modeling, where we tell everybody you cannot sort, you cannot order, you just get the instances in an internal order and that's it. A final note in respect to functions is that, at least from a naming perspective, some of the functions that were inherited from Oracle policy modeling, like instance sum, instance count, they've been renamed sum and count and so on. However, if you do already have decision services using the longer version, they will continue to be supported and no end date is currently mentioned. And finally, there's some new warning messages when you try and delete things, and my personal opinion is that some of the Oracle policy modeling decision service related messages have been improved, but I may be wrong. What's coming up now, of course, is a little demonstration of the key areas of that. We're going to focus on object lists and filter and first and last and so on. See you in a moment. Hi, so in this demonstration we're going to look at a couple of things. First of all, we're going to talk about object lists and objects. So I'm going to begin by just refreshing our memory as to what it is that we can do coming into decision services before these updates. We could have an input contract which set up an input object, and we'll call this the input. We'll put the input cars. Let's do the input cars, okay? And that means, therefore, that we can handle those input cars as inputs, and we could also have output objects. So I'll call this output bikes. Let's do output bikes. The output bikes. Let's deal with the output. First of all, that meant that I could insert an object block, and I could do something like the output bikes, and I could create essentially a table like I would used to do in Excel to infer output bikes. So we'll call this something stupid like the output number and the output bike mark. And for the sake of speed, I'm not going to have any conditions, so I'm going to just essentially create some bikes. And I could then add into my output, I could add a number, which is going to be the bike number, mapped to the output bike number, and then we'll do the output bike mark, if I can get there in time, and we'll add a string mark. Okay, and we can give some examples. There's number 1, and this is going to be a Honda, and we'll add another row, and this is going to be number 2, and this is going to be the Suzuki, and we'll add one more. This is going to be a Yamaha. So this is something that we're fairly familiar with. We can create an output contract, and then we can use an inference table, a little bit like we would have done in Excel, to create a set of outputs. So if I commit that and go to run via REST, for example, there will be no inputs, at least none that are meaningful in my particular example, and I have 3 bikes that are output. I can also add rows to my input object, but since I have no rules or anything associated with them yet, all I can do is look at that and say, oh wow. So I'm going to close off that for the moment. So we were able to input objects, and we did input cars, so let's add a couple of things to this. We'll do the car number and the car number, and we'll do one more. I think you're probably going to get this, car mark, the car mark. Okay, which of course means, therefore, that if we are in our rule base or in our block here, I could cut this block in 2, if I can just, there we go, and create a new rule block. Which means then, now that we have our input object and our output object set up, for the input object, of course, it means that we can use it in a block and say that for each of the input cars, the car is a BMW if the car mark equals BMW, or something like that. So we were familiar with this idea of having input object lists and then being able to work on the object lists using specifically scoped blocks. And for the outputs, we were able to create inference tables. That was pretty much it. So what's new? Well, what's new is, if we can go and create a new block down here, let's create a new block, is the existence of these functions that we spoke about. So for example, we could say that the filtered list of cars equals filter, followed by the input cars, followed by a filter. So we'll say the car mark equals Mercedes this time around. If I can get there. So now that we have a filtered list of cars, we can associate that with the idea of essentially of a reference relationship that we're familiar with. So now we can create an output contract and say that this is going to be output filtered, the filtered list of cars. So to finish this off, I'm going to add another row into the block that talks about the input cars, and let's remove the indent so that we populate a new attribute for our output, which is going to be called the filtered car mark. Okay, and it's always going to be equal to Mercedes, but that's not the point right now. And I can then add a new string attribute to my output. Get there in the end, the filtered car mark. So now I am creating a filtered list, and I am populating the filtered list with the necessary attributes for my output contract. So the filter function is going to be extremely useful when it comes to filtering object lists and then preparing the object list to be sent back to Oracle Policy Modeling, for example. We also spoke about something like this. The first car input equals first, and we'll call this the input cars. So this creates an instance of an object, and if we go into edit mode, go into live mode, what we could do is we could go to the input contract and we'll create a car, and we'll say this car is Mercedes, car number 1, and we'll add another one. We'll say this is a BMW. This is car number 2. Okay, so we can see here that the first car input is marking us as being record number 1, which of course is correct since it's the first car that I entered. And that's the concept of something like first or last. And once I have that object instance, I can then perform logic on it. So I'll just do something like, first of all, the last car input, just so we have an example thereof. The input cars. So what we have now is essentially a reference to one of those rows. And once we have a reference to that row, we can start playing with it. So for example, if I go back to my cars input object, I'm going to add one more field. It's going to be date of the car registration, the date, we'll call it something simple, the car registration date. Okay, so that's now part of that. And what I can do, now that I have the first car input or the last car input as a reference to a particular instance or a particular row, I could say something like the registration date of the first car equals the first car input colon, and then we can use the car registration date. So in a sense, it's a little bit like doing one of those scoped functions where you say you create a reference relationship and then you go and use the for function to find the value of an attribute in that reference. So the registration date of the first car uses the object reference called the first car input, colon the car registration date. So it's a little bit like scoping which one you want to pick and then picking that. So that's the key use of things like first and last. I didn't mention it just now, but I'll do one more for you. The first car input filtered equals first, just so we're aware of this. The input cars, the car mark is not equal to Mercedes. So it's perfectly okay to use a condition in the first and last to create more sophisticated versions. So between first, last, and the first and last condition, you should find plenty of ways to get hold of individual rows within an object list. And once you've done that, of course, you know this already, but I'll just mention it. Of course, then I could choose to output that particular information. There we go. So I could output information gleaned from the object reference using that as an example. So now that we have this rather cool little set of examples, I'm going to commit this and swap right over to Oracle Policy Modeling. And in here I have created 3 entities: the bike from the DS, the car from the DS, and the car for the DS. So in the case of bikes, we already know that it's just an output object from the decision service, so it just needs to be mapped to these 2 attributes here. The car for the DS are the cars that I send into the DS, and the car from the DS is the car or the cars that are going to come out of the decision service. I've set up the car for DS so that the bike and the car so that their identifying attribute is the mark. Same for the car for DS, and for the car from DS I haven't got any other attributes, so it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go over to my rules tab and create a new reference, and we'll go and get a reference to our decision service. In this case, it's a decision service that hasn't yet been deployed, so I'm going to, it has been deployed, sorry about that. I'll go and pick it out there. And so we're being asked for our decision service inputs. The inputs that I'm going to be sending are all instances of the car for the decision service. And before I do that, I'm just going to remind myself of the syntax: car for DS mark, car for DS number. Okay. All instances of the car for the DS, the car for DS mark, car for DS number, and the car for DS registration. I may have got that wrong. I'll go back and check it in a minute. And the first registration date, that global output, I had already created as a global attribute. The all instances of the bike, and the bike from DS mark. Again, I might have to go back and check some of these to make sure I haven't duplicated the attributes. That's just because I'm going very quickly. And then we'll have the all instances of the car from the DS, and we'll call this the car from DS mark. And click save and see what we've got. So already I can see that I've probably messed something up here. So let's go back to the car from DS. Yeah, I didn't put the word mark on there. So you know what? I'm going to go and do that now. Yeah, I'll add the word mark so that we have a similarity. Okay, and I'll set the cars up. I'll set the cars up so that they're not his and hers. Yeah. Okay, and we'll go and check this again. There we go. So now we have the bikes, which are an inferred attribute, an inferred entity coming from the decision service. So all we can do is pretty much look at those. We have the global attribute, which is a result of the filtering on the first row of our cars. Then we have the cars that we're inputting and the cars that we're receiving back. So even though you can think of this particular object / entity as having been filtered, if I go back to our projects here and we look at the DS2, we can consider here from a logical point of view that the filtered list of cars acts like a reference relationship. It's a filtered list after all. As far as you are concerned, mapping it back into Oracle Policy Modeling, it maps always to a containment relationship. There is still no way to map a filtered list to a reference relationship. So I had to create a new entity and map the filtered list to the containment relationship of this entity. So let's go ahead and see what we get when we debug. I'll reset this and I'll use the data tab. It's going to be much easier. So I'm going to create 3 cars. Car number 1, I don't know whether we'll do some simple dates because we're not actually really use it. So that's car number 1's date. The car, I appear to have messed up on my attributes. So I've got the car for DS registration and DS registration date. I need to just verify that I've got the right attribute. The car, so it's the output registration date of the first car. So I need to go and just verify that I haven't made a big mess here. So I've got 2. I've got the car registration and the car registration date. Okay. So just make sure that I've got the right one here in the reference. My bad. Okay. So back to the debug. Let's go to our car instances. Car number 1, we'll call this Mercedes. If I could type, it would help. And this is car number 1. And I'll do the car. Next car will be BMW. And this will be car number 2. And car number 3. This will be a Volvo. This will be car number 3. So now that we've completed the input of our input instances, what have we got? Over on the global attribute, we have the registration date of the first car, which is indeed the case because the Mercedes was the first car entered, and it is in fact the first row of the object that's received by the decision service. So this is the correct date. The bikes, well, we didn't have to do anything with the bikes. They're just the inferred entity block that sends the rows from the decision service to Oracle Policy Modeling. So there we have those. And then we have the car from the DS, which has successfully extracted the first row and says the first one is the Mercedes. You'll recall that in my first over here, we said that it was only if the car you'll recall over here that we had the filtered list of cars, which is what I've mapped to. So I'm receiving the first car that is a Mercedes. So that just about wraps up our little demonstration as far as mapping and filtering is concerned. One last thing, I mentioned this briefly. If I go to my project now and I go to my project, and I decide to delete this, I'll see an error message because it was already deployed. So I'd have to go and sort out the deployments first before I can delete the project. And you saw while I was busy trying to demonstrate this that there were some slightly improved error messages on the Oracle Policy Modeling side, at least in terms of clarity. So that just wraps it up for our little demonstration of filter, first, last, and mapping. See you in the next video.